Okay, I've been doing some work. Take a look at this. Alright, if you've been doing game dev for a while, this probably doesn't...
On the standard win...
Okay, I've been doing some work. Take a look at this. Alright, if you've been doing game dev for a while, this probably doesn't look like much to you. But I'm not a game dev. Or at least, I wasn't before I started making these videos. Before I started messing around with this project, I knew nothing. But now I at least know enough to fumble my way through a wave system that spawns enemies. And believe me, I did fumble. Sweet, it's working. What?
First the tide rushes in, plants a kiss on the shore, then rolls out to sea, and the sea is very still once more. So I rush to your side like the oncoming tide, with one burning fire. Will your arms open wide? At last we're face to face, and as we kiss through an embrace, I can tell, I can feel you are love, you are real, really mine in the wind, in the rain, in the sun, like the tide at its end. I'm at peace in the web of your on shore and rolls out to sea, and the sea is very still once more. Oh, yeah. Rushes in. First the tide rushes in, plants a kiss on the shore, the sea, and the sea is very still once more. So I rush to your side like the oncoming tide, with one burning fire. Will your arms open wide? At last we're face to face, and as we kiss through an embrace, I can tell, I can feel you are loved, you are real, really mine in the winged rain, in the sun, like the tide at its ebb. I'm at peace in the web of your love.
What do they call it? A bust? I'm gonna bust. I'm gonna bust, baby. I forgot I had a microphone on and a webcam for a second. Okay. It's called a bust. I only know that because of Foster's Home, by the way. Foster's for imaginary friends. It's the only reason why I know what a bust is. Yeah.
I think we've had enough busting up around here. Can we please focus?
Responses? Toothpaste disaster in the foyer. Miss Francis, finally.
Trying to figure out how to do top-down perspective for that. Guess I could look look it up. Top-down 2D bust statue. This one looks like me right now. Okay. Never mind. How come I'm signed out of YouTube? Oh.
let's go ahead and get started. Just warning you, there probably will not be time left over for questions. So if you have them, feel free to keep them in case I end a little bit early. I do tend to talk very quickly when I'm nervous. But in the worst case scenario, keep your questions and you can email me or tweet at me with your questions and I'd be happy to discuss them with you. But let's go ahead and get started on writing modular characters for system-driven games. You might know me as the captain of Kit Fox Games, which I started 5 years ago. Our biggest releases were Moon Hunters a couple of years ago. Last year, we released The Shrouded Isle. Both of those featured what we would call lightly, at least procedural characters. And we are soon releasing Boyfriend Dungeon. Very exciting. Not system-driven characters, by the way, extremely hand-authored. So please don't interpret this talk as saying you must create system-driven characters or all games should have system-driven characters. That's ridiculous.
I forgot. Okay, so I'm actually just drawing the environments right now. Anyways. And then I'll add the assets.
Last year, I also helped Taryn Adams of Dwarf Waitress co-edit procedural generation in game design. And if that's a textbook that sounds interesting to you, please know I didn't write any of it, but I did co-edit lovely 25 different authors on lots of different subjects. I am extremely proud of it. And I actually have a discount voucher for 20% off up here on the stage. So if that's interesting to you, you should grab it just in case. And next year, we're actually going to be working together again, this time writing chapters, both of us, and also editing other people's procedural storytelling and game design. So I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of things that make interesting generators, the kinds of things that make terrible generators. I've made some things that are terrible and some that aren't. And for this particular talk, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Emily Short and Jason Grinblatt, whose work I am building on extremely transparently in this talk. So you're going to hear their names a lot. And if you're interested in this topic, you absolutely must follow both of their work, ideally on Twitter, but if not, I guess in real life-ish. But let's get started. So I'm going to assume that the goal of creating a system-driven game is to create something emergent and uniquely interesting, something that's more than the sum of its parts. If all you really wanted was A and then B and then C, obviously you would author it yourself. But writers are often frustrated by systems-based writing because we want to write towards an experience, and instead it often feels like we're asked to create a pile of unrelated words, phrases, and scenes, and after a while of creating these word piles, it's easy to feel like our efforts are actually less than the sum of our parts. And it's especially easy to combine these and make it feel predictable or repetitive, which Kate Compton has coined the oatmeal problem in her blog post, So You Want to Make a Generator. Quote, I can generate 10,000 bowls of oatmeal, each oat in a different position and orientation, and mathematically speaking, they will be completely unique. But the user will just see a lot of oatmeal. So she points out that what we're really looking for is perceptual uniqueness, not true uniqueness, just perceptual. And throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to that as meaning, which is kind of a fluffy, hippie word. But if you're more math-oriented and it makes you feel better, feel free to think of it as perceptual uniqueness, because that is kind of what I mean. I'm just a little bit lazy and colloquial, I guess. And at this point, you might be wondering, why even talk about characters at all? Why not places or objects or worlds? There is a whole universe of stuff out there to generate. A civilization, for example, can be every bit as complex as a person. But after contributing to a civilization Twitter bot, GP Lackey's Unknown Peoples is a delight, I realized the same principles can be applied fundamentally across types of generators, whether you're generating civilizations or furniture or people. So if you're curious about text generation in particular, I do recommend checking out Tracery or Cheapbots Done Quick, which is what made this lovely Twitter bot. But for this talk, I will generally be assuming that you're generating actual characters, full characters as game objects, not just text generation. So that if anytime I refer to generating text, I'm probably using it as a symbol for a greater data space, if that makes sense. But I'm focusing on characters in this talk because they are a common fantasy for procedural designers and a common nightmare for writers. And they're a fantasy/nightmare for the exact same reasons, which is that humans are excellent pattern finders, and patterns in generated people feel more artificial and alienating than patterns that we see in generated places or objects. There is no such thing as an uncanny valley for furniture, right? So if we can generate people, we can generate anything. So ideally, we want characters' diverse information bits to funnel down into a singular, perfect moment of understanding. And so we need to change the way that we write and the way that our writing is used so that a bunch of words can become meaningful, memorable moments for our players. So I'm going to break this down into 4 things. Overall, the base fundamentals are building orthogonally, and then we're going to talk a little bit about creating higher order meaning, and then we're going to talk about surfacing that meaning to the player, and then why iteration with your co-authors is actually extra important in this particular field. So orthogonality, I'm going to use a lot. I didn't have a lazy colloquialism for this one, and I'm going to use it because well, to clarify what I mean by system-driven, I don't mean linear, and I also don't mean branching. That's kind of barely a system. What I'm talking about is system-driven games that provide a possibility space for the player to explore. So rather than telling a particular story or a particular set of stories, we're instead only saying these are the kinds of things, the kinds of stories that might be told in my game. And those boundaries are here marked on this helpful diagram as X1, X2, and X3. And that was coined as a story volume at Project Horseshoe a couple of years ago. And in Jason Greenblatt's words, a story volume, quote, encloses a family of emergent stories created by a set of carefully curated system parameters. And these parameters are often fluffy, things like themes and your setting and so on. Maybe your story volume includes societal claps or love ballads or moon festivals. It's kind of up to you what your story volume is about, but you are defining what is allowed and what isn't, rather than what should be. And the key for me was to wrap my head around the orthogonality, that in order for this beautiful space to exist, X1 must be a completely different axis than X2 or X3. A value on X1 needs to be easily separated from a value on X2 so that they can be combined to create meaningfully different results. We're used to thinking of this physically. We're used to seeing different character traits physically, such as height or weight, be combined freely. To use an example from Emily Short's chapter 21 in my book, height and weight can be considered orthogonal and usually are. You can combine them freely. You could have tall and thin or tall and wide, whatever. And usually we don't get the impulse to correlate these with each other. We don't suddenly think, oh, hair length should probably predict skin color. But we do tend to do that with personalities, and it becomes very fuzzy very quickly. So this might seem up front like an example of 4 orthogonal personality traits. Combining these, let's say you could have low or high of any of these 4 traits. Oh wow, I can create 60 different personality types, incredible. Unfortunately, as Emily Short points out, this difference might not be observable or meaningful to the player. These traits, flirtiness and extroversion in particular, do overlap in the kinds of behaviors they can create, because both traits govern whether or not a character might want to talk to you, and if so, for how often, how intimately. So players won't always see the difference between a very flirty character versus a very extroverted character. This is also a problem in real life, but that's a different question. So she recommends, for example, thinking of what if romantic interest replaced flirtiness. And that's interesting because it is observed under different circumstances. A shy person can still express high or low romantic interest in the player, and a highly extroverted can express both of these feelings. And so they are much more modular. And after you've picked your orthogonal traits, this is where it starts getting very tempting to correlate them, especially in a straightforward, logical-seeming way. And you should resist this temptation. I mean, you might be tempted to make someone imaginative, much more likely to fall in love with the player, because that makes sense, right? Or maybe it's more interesting, or it's more realistic, or you're afraid of your characters being too random. But it's bad, and you should think about orthogonality very deeply, because even if you're talking about orcs, you want orthogonal traits, not only for story volume reasons, but also it allows for the possibility of interesting transformations. Part of the success of the Nemesis system is that depending on the input, different traits can be applied and combined at will. Zun here could be burned or scarred or strengthened in any number of system-driven ways, depending on what happens. He could change completely depending on the player and roll of the dice. If archers or marksmen here were more likely to get, I don't know, a hand injury, I mean, it would make more sense, but it would also be much less interesting and rich for the player to explore. Orthogonal traits also allow you to hide some of those traits and reveal them over time, letting the player get to know the character in an interesting way. If being an ascetic, like Zaina there, number 4, if being an ascetic implied something about what kind of vice she had, it wouldn't be interesting to learn what it actually was because you'd have a feeling of what it was already. Getting to know her would feel less like meeting someone and more like just filling out the rest of the cookie cutter. In Moonhunters, we made the player myth a bit orthogonal, such that different components, such as events that you encountered or cause of death or your constellation, could be combined at will, which did reduce redundancy, but the individual pieces remained maybe too orthogonal, I would say. I mean, system designers and writers should absolutely work together to keep your story volume free of arbitrary or logical limitations. Lateral, meaningful connections between systems can make your story volume absolutely richer, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But direct constraints within a single system, such as your character traits, usually make your story volume poorer. So let's think with our writer brain. So how many people here identify primarily as writers? Writers. Oh, interesting. How many people identify primarily as system designers? And what about narrative designers? Okay, interesting. Well, I think it is important for system designers to put on their writer brains also, but let's all do that, and think beyond piles of words and descriptors to figure out what our meaning actually is. I mean, without a writer, a person is a meaningless jumble of descriptors, and making them feel powerful and coherent is more than just pruning their vocabulary. If you do carefully make a pool of possible words, you do get occasionally interesting outputs. If you only generate words and actions related to spaceships and aliens, it will feel sci-fi. And it'll occasionally be kind of sensible and interesting. But it'll also start feeling like oatmeal eventually, no matter how well you tune it, because there will be occasional blips of meaning, and the rest won't really fit together. They'll just be bits. And it's because you've used the same structure for all of them. You've only generated the bottommost layer of meaning, the corpus of information. So even if you have an enormous variety of options in that bottom layer, players will still be able to sense deeply that they're all just buckets filled with different flavors of water. Artists and writers often create coherence in our creations kind of subconsciously. We attach meaning and texture to the things we create. And in this slide, you can kind of see one character that feels aloof, and one that feels a bit rebellious, and one that might be a bit wistful. This is conveyed consistently in the design of their posture, their costume, and body, and yet they are not cookie cutters. So you have to help your algorithm do the same thing. Help it make connections between seemingly unconnected systems and content. I'm going to talk about how to do that in a moment, but if you can figure out a way to create higher order patterns of meaning, even a little bit, you'll have more satisfying results because you're varying the shape of the bucket, not just the water inside. So what are the themes of your world? What does your story volume reveal about humanity and the universe? Is it a utopian world of curiosity and hope? Is it a pulp adventure of good battling and overcoming evil? Is it a female power struggle and isolation? Whatever your themes are, these archetypes can become the highest layer of your systems, shaping your bucket that your systems fill in with content. So when you start thinking about what your highest level of meaning are, this should be reflected in the very essence of your systems, ideally not only in characters, but also in places and objects and so on. One of the best examples of this so far are Emily Short's Annals of the Periques, which is a generated novel. It's a guide to fictional places in an England-ish setting. She defined these 5 suits in her corpus: salt, beeswax, venom, mushroom, and egg. Yes, she's wonderful.
I don't know how shading works, dude.
And what she did was she went through her corpus of information and tagged them all according to which suit or suits they could identify with. So for example, something that was tagged venom could be something colorful or something deceitful, something serpentine, something ornate, brightly colored, beautiful. And these are things that normally a machine wouldn't think to associate. Normally it would just think to associate bright colored things with, I don't know, like even if you had a machine learning thing going on, it would say, oh, it's childlike or something. But in the meaning of her universe, venom became this underlying current where you could kind of sense, oh, a venom place feels different from an egg place. So if this is at all interesting to you, I do highly recommend her talk going much more deeply into this from ProcJam 2016, entitled 5 Strategies for Collaborating with a Machine. But there's lots of different classification systems close at hand. You can probably think of suits off the top of your head really quickly if you don't want to create your own. I mean, tarot offers something. I mean, cards. I mean, at the very basic level, you can think of elements.